Chapter 21. The Phantom Grip. The light emanating from the fixture gave off a slight yellow hue. The room was fully lit, but one of the bulbs in the fixture had burnt out, and as a result, the room wasn't as bright. It was a kitchen. A kind of relic of a kitchen, though. It had an older aesthetic to it, the one you might find in your first apartment or home. The cabinets had a cheap and old wooden look to them, and the counters were a generic cream color. The cheap laminate was bubbling up next to the sink where water over the years had splashed out and wreaked war on the cheap flooring. The dishwasher was black and at least 15 years old. The fridge was once white, but time had added a yellow stain to it. It was also on the smaller size, the kind of fridge you would expect to see in a single person or a newly married couple's home. Above that sink was a small window that faced the backyard. Only when you looked through the window, all you saw was black. The microwave, also showing the age of the appliance, was at least the same color as the stove, which was white like the aged fridge. David knew this place. It was the kitchen of the house where he spent the first 4 years of his life. He only remembered bits and pieces of this house. He remembered the small bedroom that was his, the one bathroom in the house, and the room he was in now, the kitchen. Only he wasn't 4 years old. He could see his own reflection in the microwave. He was far from 4. Looking back at him was the haggard gaze of a tired man. He leaned a little closer to his own reflection in the microwave, then sharply turned his head towards the kitchen entrance that led to a small hallway. He could hear a TV playing some show that sounded oddly familiar, and 2 voices speaking in low tones. He stuck his head out into the hallway, looking down towards where the living room would be. He saw the light of a TV screen against the hallway wall as the program played. He considered walking down to that room, that living room with the TV and voices. He realized in some unconscious way that he was reliving a memory, the memory of maybe a 3-year-old version of himself, that he couldn't piece it all together. Right before he began to take the first step towards the living room, his whole body froze in place. Another voice, a very light one, spoke to him. It was so faint and light, he wasn't sure if he was hearing a whisper through his ears or if it was in his head. "Over here." The whisper came. David spun around to face the direction the voice came from, but there was nothing, only the back door that led to the backyard. It was now open when just a moment ago it had been closed. When he stared out the door, he saw nothing but black. Again, the whisper. "Over here," is all it said to him. David began to approach the open door. For some strange reason, even after everything that had happened in the last 2 weeks or so, he wasn't really all that afraid. Something about the invitation that the voice was offering him didn't make him feel like he should expect a fight or danger. He kept moving towards the open door. As he reached the door, he grabbed the handle with his left hand. It was a reactionary move, but when he felt his fingers wrap around the handle to open the door fully, he looked down. He saw his hand was in perfect health, and then he looked again back towards the kitchen and the hallway. He could still hear the TV and the voices talking, pausing occasionally to watch the show. Then he walked through the door into the black. The moment he stepped through the door, he noticed that it had grown deeply quiet, an unnatural emptiness in what should have been a neighborhood backyard. That was because, as he walked further into space, he found there was nothing there. It was pure black. He looked down to his feet and observed that the ground was either as black as the rest of this area or see-through that simply showed nothing but black on the other side. The only thing he could be sure of was that it was solid. He looked back at the door. It was still there, and the yellowish light coming from the inside fixture still lit the room up. The voice again. "Look around you," it said to him. David looked around, and his jaw dropped. He was looking at giant multicolored spheres. Due to his youth being consumed by the drug Chembal, it took him a minute to register what they were, since school didn't much cover these types of things anymore. They were planets. The only way he was sure of it was because of the one planet that everyone in grade school still learned about, Earth. He was looking at planet Earth in full detail. Several other ones too, though he couldn't be sure if they were the ones that were supposed to circle the same sun as Earth or not. That knowledge was not something he was given in detail. But he saw them now, and it was breathtaking. He stared, completely engrossed in the sight. He felt his left hand curl into a tight fist. After a moment of pure awe, He could himself come back to the question of where was he. He was just in his early childhood home, the one his parents owned until he was 4. He knew the reason they left that house was not only because of his father having been reassigned, but also due to the great buyout of 2030, when the economy collapsed on itself after years of inflation and interest hikes. By the time it all fell through, nearly every person in the UCA that still owned property found themselves unable to afford the cost of being owners. The government and a few special interest groups and companies came up with a last-minute save for the people of the Union. Sell your assets to these companies, and instead of being sent out to the streets from foreclosure, you could rent the property you once owned. In David's mother's case, she couldn't afford the rent on the home they lived in without his father's income. That coupled with her having been re-educated, she was only able to work a job with a pay ceiling that would never increase, so they ended up moving to an apartment. But this was not his childhood home. That was back on Earth, which he was staring at from afar, as well as several other amazing-looking planets. He noticed then that when he looked at the Earth, he didn't see the moon. If he could find the moon, maybe, he could have an idea of where he was. He began to look around again. His left hand's grip got tighter. As he circled around, he caught a new image, one that stopped him dead in his spot. It almost looked like the sun and moon when the moon covers the sun's face and creates an eclipse. But this was unlike any version of that he had seen in his life. The center was pitch black, like the area he was in. That part reminded him of an eclipse. But the rays that normally would be an orange-yellow color came out in eggshell white colors. "Whoa," David said in further awe. The sun looked unlike any version of it he had seen before, and he couldn't take his eyes off it. For some reason he couldn't explain, he knew it was the sun. His left hand's grip grew even tighter again. "Over here," came that voice again. David turned back to where the doorway was facing. He could see in the pitch black next to it a figure, but he couldn't make out any other part of it out other than it was there. David looked down at his left fist. The grip was starting to make the muscles in his hand cramp and was growing uncomfortable. "Over here," the voice said to him again. He realized it wanted him to go back into the kitchen, but David looked around again at all these amazing sights and realized he wasn't ready to leave yet. I want to look at it a little bit more," David said to the voice. It was the first time he addressed it. There was nothing for a moment, as he felt the cramping muscle in his left hand grow more painful, but he was able to avoid paying it much attention. "Go home," was all the voice said to him. It wasn't threatening or even commanding of him, but he sensed the firmness in its statement. He began to walk towards the door again, somewhat disheartened by this moment coming to an end. He began to walk back to the doorway, back to the place he had arrived from. As he walked, he looked up at the sight of the world, the steps he took taking him further away each time. He looked back at the black and white sun one more time. He felt like he would never see it like this again. He looked back to the door he was walking towards. The figure had disappeared now. His left hand was stuck in an ever-tightening and painful fist. As he entered the door, he closed it behind him, entering the kitchen once again. Only it was different now. The setting had changed to something more modern. The boring gray neutral colors of the walls and the appliances reminded him of his own apartment back in STL, and he felt a dash of annoyance enter his gut. At the small coffee table in the kitchen sat a woman in her late 40s. He realized it was the exact way he saw his mother for the last time, nearly 2 years ago. His left hand's grip on itself had now become so intense that his forearm was cramping. He looked down at his balled-up fist, wincing in pain, and then looked back at his mother. She was blankly looking over at a wall with a cup of 30-minute-old coffee resting on the table. A certain kind of sadness, or maybe just vacancy, was in her expression. This is how she looked the last time he visited her, when her brother, whom David never saw in his life, had passed. He went with her to the funeral. The people there were related to him in one way or another, but he had never really known any of them. From what David had gathered in his teenage years, his mother's family had been part of the Chembal middle class of society and never approved of his father when his mother got sweet on him. Because of her love for his father, she was now a single mother who had been re-educated, a blight on the family. David was the garnish on the insult. He bore a strong resemblance to his father, and as a byproduct, carried his sins on in the physical form. He had taken her home after the funeral and found that she had some coffee from that morning still in the pot. At the time 2 years ago, David himself was a blank vessel of Chembal usage and decided that the coffee would be good enough for this woman with whom he shared blood with. They sat at that table for about an hour in silence as David waited for an appropriate amount of time to pass before he left. He knew it would be a couple more years until he had to see her again, and figured he should make it look like he spent some time with her while she grieved. But the thing about it all was, she wasn't grieving. She just sat there with the exact same expression as she always did. If her brother's death affected her somewhere in her mind, she no longer expressed it. He realized that while it felt like only 5 or 10 minutes had passed when he was in that quiet black space, in this place nearly 30 years had passed by. He sat down at the table with her, but she didn't register him. His forearm and hand were really starting to cramp up. It felt like the muscles were tearing. He looked at his left hand gripped up in a tightly bound fist. He couldn't tell it to relax. He began to try to peel his fingers apart with his right hand, but the grip was too much. As he doubled over and moaned in agony from the pain at the table, his mother, who almost never said anything anymore, spoke to him suddenly. "You were gone so long, David." As she said it to him, her stare went from the wall to his face. Her eyes bore into him like they never had before, and the pain from his hand combined with this made him panic. He shot upright in bed, sweating from the panic, as well as the pain. The room was dimly lit, nothing like the kitchen he had just been in. It was filthy and smelt rancid, like something was rotting. His left hand was still in a vice-like grip, and he raised his hand to see why he was still gripping it so hard. What he saw made him nearly faint. A white bandage with some dark red stain over a shortened version of his left hand was the sight he was greeted with. It took a moment to realize it wasn't a shortened version of his hand. The hand was not there at all. The room began to spin as David studied his left hand, or lack thereof, in disbelief. The pain of his left hand squeezing was still occurring, and he saw that his forearm was tense and flexing. What the fuck?" yelled David in horror as he stared at his stumped wrist. He couldn't get a grip on what was happening. He looked at the rest of himself in fear of any other pieces missing. Starting with his right hand, which was still there and working fine, some red bruising had pooled around his wrist from where it was cuffed. There was an IV with red liquid attached to his vein. He snapped his head down to his legs and feet, all still there. He moved his toes to make sure they were still operating. "Where the hell am I? Where is everybody?" David yelled out, almost fearing the answer. For a brief second, it sounded as if he was alone in this stinky, dark room. Then a metal door opened, and 3 figures appeared. The first one made David's skin crawl since he didn't recognize the face. It was a man, maybe in his 40s, hard to tell, with slicked back black hair. He had sunglasses on, which made little sense in a place as dark as this, and tattoos that covered his neck and arms. He wore a Hawaiian button-up style shirt and stone-washed jeans. Then behind him came the woman he met in the alley. Strawberry hair and dark skin. She had taken off the hoodie she was wearing in the alley and tied it to her waist. Underneath was an athletic shirt that was loose on her body like the hoodie was. Behind her stood Brick. His shirt was off, and he had a bandage on the right side of his chest and one on his right abdomen, as well as 2 on his right shoulder. He stared at them dumbfounded as the man in the bright-colored shirt waltzed over to him and checked on some other wires attached to him. After looking at all the medical crap around David in a circle, the man spoke in a voice that sounded more like it belonged to a street hustler than a medical professional. "Well, good news and bad news. Bad news, if you are left-handed, better start practicing spelling your name. The good news, you lost a lot of blood getting here to me, and now I've nearly got you tanked back up, buddy." The joking nature in his voice didn't soothe David in the slightest. In fact, reality was beginning to settle in, and sheer red anger and hatred was filling up within him. Since there was nothing he could do about it now, he simply looked back down at his left hand as tears began to well up in his eyes. David can only remember crying twice in his life. The first time was when he was 8 and broke 2 fingers during football practice. It wasn't tears from having to be benched. He never cared about playing all that much. It was the pain that came from being 8 years old with 2 broken fingers. The second time was tonight. Although he did his best to hold back the tears, 1 or 2 escaped the sides of his eyes and trickled down his face. David hated crying. He knew that it was considered socially acceptable to cry, and that long ago the stoic male myth had been considered dismantled. but it was never his bag. One major reason for that was he never felt anything much more in his day-to-day life than basic desires like eating, showering, smoking, drinking, and exercising. But the other reason was, regardless of what the world said on the topic of men crying, it made him feel weak and defeated. After a brief, awkward moment of the sleazy-looking fellow patting his back, David looked at all of them. "What the fuck happened? And who is this dude?" David asked, the whole time fighting back tears, making his voice sound even more hoarse than it had in the couple days following his throat nearly being crushed by Brick. Dolly stepped forward. "The hounds played us, pure and simple. They followed me around, a party of 3, but as you know, they had a whole damn posse waiting. Once they found out they could have not just me, but the team that cracked the DOE, they swarmed us. You got caught. We didn't see how. You were locked up in military-grade cuffs. I'm good with a lockpick, but I was going to need at least 2 hours with those type of locks. Brick saw only one option to save you from capture, taking off your hand. The dude is Dr. Chops. He is an underground surgeon for the organization. When we freed you, we raced here to him to stop the bleeding and keep you alive." She said her words reached David, but seemed to go past him as they were said. The pain in his left hand, correct that. The pain in his non-existent left hand was still causing him a great deal of pain. David looked up at Dr. Chops. "Why didn't you bring it with us to have Dr. Chops here reattach?" David exclaimed. Dolly and Brick exchanged looks of bewilderment, and David noticed the look of nausea spread across Dolly's face. "To be honest, everything happened so fast, I didn't even think of bringing it." "I am so sorry, David," Dolly stammered apologetically. "My fucking hand feels like it's just trying to clench as hard as it can. I can feel the muscles cramping and almost like they are tearing," David said between clenched teeth. "Yeah, that's got to be the phantom limb symptom. Your mind and body haven't really adjusted to the lack of your hand yet. Sorry to say it will take some time to get over those feelings," Dr. Chops said in a somewhat impartial tone. David used his one good hand and grabbed the doctor by his bright-colored shirt collar. "When will it stop, and is there anything I can do to get it to stop now?" David growled. The pain and lack of painkillers, mixed with a desperate need for a cigarette, was beginning to push him to a point of frustration where friend or foe was not going to matter. Dr. Chops put his hands up in a defenseless posture. "Easy, man. Easy. This ain't going to be an easy adjustment, I know. You ain't the first in my chop shop to come in missing pieces. Look, take some deep breaths, all right? I can see the tension has climbed into your forearm. I'll apply some pressure to relax the muscle, and hopefully that will help some." David let go of the doctor, and the man moved over to the left of David and began to move the muscle in David's tightened forearm around. The tension lowered some, but the overall pain factor was still alarming. "I need a goddamn cigarette, man," David said, holding back yet another round of hate filled with tears. Dolly moved over to him and gave him a cigarette, but had to light it for him. He felt reduced to a toddler who needed his ass wiped for him. He took a deep drag of the smoke and closed his eyes as he let the nicotine enter his system and hoped it would help him with the level of shock he was experiencing. Then, something snapped in his head, and his eyes popped open with a new level of worry and fear. "Where's Ashley? Where's Trace?" he asked, in a tone mixed with concern and rage. Brick's body language hadn't changed since he entered the room. His giant, unemotional presence in the room was the exact opposite of Dolly, who looked down at her high-priced shoes. "We all split up when the trucks showed up. I lost sight of everyone. Only reason I ran into Brick was he killed 4 of them and took 2 bullets and a trank. I helped him take down 2 more before we found you, but the others with you." Before she could think of what to follow that up with, Brick interjected for the first time since David woke up. "They got rounded up. Ain't no other way to say it. I saw Trace get brought down before we turned the first set of corners in the alleys. Never saw Ashley again," he said with his gravelly, deep voice. The thought of both Ashley and Trace, especially Ashley being cornered and caught by the hillbilly drug addict parade, only to be shipped off to the SDT, made David nearly dry heave. Both had been with him since the beginning, in Ashley's case, the very moment he began to see the world as it really was. There was no way he was going to leave them to that fate. Even in the state he was going to find them and save them, or die like the nerve endings in his left hand had in the process. "We have to go back for them," David said weakly, as he began to prop himself up on the stretcher he was laying in. I don't know about that. It's been a couple hours now. No way we can locate where they took them, said Dolly. Plus, if I am being honest with you, there's no way the hounds haven't called the SDT to come and collect their prize, she continued. David felt a flush of fresh anger run up from his gut into his chest. Hold the actual fuck on, lady. You were the one that was tagged. Had we not shown up, those three would have called in their goon squad and snagged you up really quick. Now you want to stand there and preach about letting them be sacrificed? The venom in David's voice was thick. He was ready to rip the IV that was pumping blood into his body out of his right arm and grab a hold of her. The only things holding him back was lack of a left hand, needing all the help he could get, and the fact she was his only connection to the AP-1 site in the Arctic. She's right, Nash. It's risky. The payout might only be death. I ain't looking to get deep-sixed by some bumfuck hillbilly in Montreal. I came for the power plant, Brick said. Well, shit, thought David to himself. I have to convince both of them, not just her. He decided he would have to make points based off logic, and not so much based off feeling. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes for a moment, thinking out the line of thought he would have to take here. Look, he started. The bottom line is, if we don't go and get our team back before the SDT gets them, we are down a gun and a hacker. Even if you don't think Ashley is effective, which she has pulled our asses out of a few fires at this point, you can't deny we need Trace. He's the best shot we got at cracking through the firewalls that the power plant might have, David said, his voice almost cracking under his anger. Brick's expression didn't change, nor did his controlled, freakishly calm breathing. What a truly trained psychopath, thought David to himself. Dolly was easier to read. However, she looked toward the wall as if she was trying to come up with a different solution. There's plenty of hackers worth their salt in the organization, Nash, Dolly said. None we will find this close to the finish line willing to decode Trace's files and tackle a power plant in the most remote part of the world, David retorted. Truth is, we lose Trace. We lose this whole fucking thing. The system you all claim to be fighting against will just keep pounding you face in the dirt while you get fucked by them, he continued. Dolly looked back at Brick, who finally showed some reaction by hanging his head to the left, wrinkling his eyes into that "it's a good point" look. That was the most human appearance he had ever seen Brick make, other than the look of his face as he was killing someone. Dolly turned back to David. Then what exactly do you think we can do, and how do we do it quicker than the SDT's response time? There's 3 of us, and you are missing a hand man, Dolly stated. David had some knee-jerk reaction plans developing, but nothing horribly concrete. Well look, Brick and you alone killed 6 of the hounds, right? So that means they either aren't trained, or they are all so junked out of their heads on brain rate or some other hard-ass street drugs that we will be better than them. We just need to know where they are, who they are, and we need some firepower, he said. In truth, none of that was a plan. It was more of observations that he hoped could be connected into one. Right, real clever. You know everything we were able to figure out in the alley. So what do we do with shit we already know? Dolly asked. Just then, Dr. Chops's voice cut in. Shit, buddy. Why don't you all just hit up Nex? He said. David's head jerked hard into Chop's direction. The doctor was putting a fresh bag of something on one of the IVs connected to David's right arm. Nex? There's a Nex up here? David asked with desperation. Shit, buddy. There's a Nex everywhere. You just gotta know someone who knows him is all, Chops replied, his eyes hidden by his sunglasses in the dark, damp, stinky room. Do you know the Montreal Nex, Chops? David asked. Sure, do, buddy, but so does Baby Doll over there, Chops said as he nodded his head in Dolly's direction. Honestly, it's no wonder so many operators take so much damage and such short life expectancy. You don't think too hard when it counts, said the good doctor. David looked back at Dolly. Does the Nex down here have the intel and resources we need, Dolly? David asked. Yeah, he'll have what we need. She sighed like she was back in Cali somewhere on a beach and someone got sand on her beach towel, or whatever Valley girls sighed down there. Fuck it. You all risked it to get me. I know what you say about the power plant and your hacker is true. Might as well make our move while the hounds are unprepared, I guess. Dr. Chops removed David's IVs for him and gave David his hand to help him get up and off the stretcher. As David's feet and body made contact with the hard cement floor, he felt his body wash over with the feeling one gets when they are doped up. He began to sway and instinctively reached out for the stretcher handles with his left hand. His left hand that wasn't there, and the stump of what remained of his left wrist collided with the metal handle, making his face go white with searing pain. He nearly fell at that moment, the mixture of whatever drugs in his system laced with the shock of pain, the jarring the severed nerve ends against a solid metal object. Frankly, it was worse than any sucker punch could be. Whoa there, buddy. I guess I should have mentioned there's still some morphine running through your veins. I know you think you're some kind of Billy badass, but this ain't a movie. You are going to have to let yourself adjust. My advice. If you do run this little rescue mission, maybe do so with as much sneaking around and cover shots as you can, Chops said to David. David had started to regain some of his senses after the near collapse and wave of nausea passed. He looked at Chops, shaking his head that he understood, and took a moment to straighten himself up. I hate taking shit for this very reason, but since you put morphine in me, got anything to help me move a little quicker? David asked, feeling somewhat disgusted with himself. David never really partook in any drugs besides alcohol in his life, but this wasn't the time to go walking into a gunfight with your faculties operating at subpar levels. It would be a challenge with the one hand. Yeah, buddy, I got some crankers. They are basic uppers made from some cleaner option than other shit people crank out on the streets. I wouldn't advise overdoing it with them. They are like any medication or drug, addictive after a time, Chops said, as he walked over to a small desk in the corner and fished through his drawers until he came up with an orange transparent bottle. Right, so take one about 20 minutes before you do anything that will require your full attention. One of these little bad boys should give you all the attention you need and then some. Avoid taking one for about 4 hours after the effects wear down. David took the bottle in his right hand and put it in his jeans pocket. He had to watch every step he took. His feet felt like clumps of heavy rocks attached to his legs as he moved. Any change in the air could have very well caused him to take a tumble. Shit like this is why I don't fuck with drugs, damn it, David thought to himself as the trio went to open the door to Dr. Chop's office. When they got out into the next room, David realized the stench in Dr. Chop's office wasn't coming from that room, but rather from this tunnel. That was because it was a damn sewer. He was hiding his work and himself in a sewer, which was smart because almost no one would think to look for a doctor in a filthy place like sewage tunnels. As they made their way through the tunnels, the smell mixed with David's unwanted high constantly caused him to sweat and run short of breath. He felt like he couldn't breathe, and when he did, it almost always caused him to gag at the scent. Couple that with the throbbing in his left wrist, reminding him that once the morphine and whatever else Chops put in his body wore off, he was going to be in agony. David shuddered at the thought as his right hand slowly reached towards his left's stump. He was in the back following Dolly and Brick since he was unconscious when they first came through here. He felt anger and depression begin to mount in his chest again. The fear of what Ashley might be subjected to right that moment caused David to have an overwhelming need to successfully pull this off. David could not fathom what her reaction would be. Would she be disgusted with him for letting her get captured? Would she be disappointed that he came to save them versus continuing with the mission? The reality of the whole situation was she was here because of David. She was being held hostage because of David, and he was disfigured because of himself. The anger and guilt David felt about her capture was overwhelming. Just thinking about losing her made David's stomach tighten and lurch, causing his already high level of nausea to almost overtake him. No matter what the cost he had to find her, no matter the cost, nothing mattered more to him right now. Not the mission, not the rest of the team. Just her. He didn't think she would think like that, but something he was learning quickly in this world was that people can surprise you when you least expect it. He thought about the hound leader, the tall, slender, unkempt, stubbled man. Reese, they called him. He wanted to kill Reese. He had never really wanted to kill anyone before. He long ago realized if it was do or die, he would do. But this wasn't a matter of that. This was just a desire to kill. This was such a new urge that he wasn't sure what to do with these feelings. Here, Brick said, coming to a stop by a ladder that led to a manhole cover. He climbed up about 2 steps before being able to lift the manhole and pushed it up off the opening of the tunnel. He climbed the rest of the way out, followed by Dolly. Finally, a stumbling and struggling David, who had to learn at this moment how to climb with both one hand and a slow response time due to the morphine pumping through his battered body. While it only took Dolly and Brick a few seconds to climb up along the ladder, it took David close to 30 seconds. Once he got up to the surface, he stood there breathing heavily and trying to catch his breath. He reached for the cigarettes in his pocket, fiddled with one in the package, put it to his lips, and then finally got to light it. "What a damn embarrassment," he said out loud as Brick covered the manhole again. Dolly looked at him. "What do you mean?" she asked. David held his left wrist up. "Takes me 30 seconds to climb a 5-foot ladder. Takes me 20 seconds to light a damn smoke. It's a damn embarrassment," he said with loathing brewing in his chest for the tall hick asshole named Reese. "It is what it is, sugar. Bitching and moaning ain't putting your hand back like a magic trick." "So deal," Dolly said. David decided if that was her way of motivating him to overcome the very fresh sting of losing part of a limb, she wasn't going to be doing any public speeches anytime soon. They made their way to the car they arrived in. It was the one Dolph had lent the group when they went out to help Dolly out of her jam. The back seat had a lot of dried blood on the floorboard, but it appeared like they must have covered him up quickly, as there was very little on the seats. David sighed at the sight and got in. He wasn't going to be driving, but at least he was in the passenger seat. "Gotta say, I fucking hate driving, but the chica said you were gonna die if she didn't hang in the back with you and stop the bleeding as we drove here," Brick said as he moved into the back seat. Brick's unnaturally large size gave him an inclination for back seats of cars. They gave him more legroom. Dolly looked over at David. "Wasn't easy. You were gushing fast, and the not-so-friendly giant back there needed directions," Dolly said as she started the car. "Shit, you could have been a goner if he took maybe 2 more wrong turns," she said as she laughed and headed off to the Montreal Necks.